Today's topic is going to be the end of the Cold War and a little bit about President Reagan. So we're going to understand the Reagan administration a little bit because the background on him is he's going to change how the United States actually fights the Cold War. We're going to talk about some of the policy choices and decisions that are going to face the United States in the 1980s. And it should be no surprise to anybody, we're going to talk about the ways the United States won the Cold War. Obviously, we did win the Cold War because we are not communists, and if the Soviets won, we would probably be some kind of a socialist nation. And we're also going to talk about the effects that the end of the Cold War has on the United States. So some of your vocab, Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev, they're going to be two of our most important people. Ronald Reagan is obviously going to be president of the United States during the 1980s in the fall of the Soviet Union, and Mikhail Gorbachev is going to be the last Soviet premier, the leader of the Soviet Union. We'll go over glasnost and perestroika, but you can see the two words there and kind of what they mean. Conservative, Ronald Reagan is going to be conservative. They want limited government. They want the economy to be one of the most important focuses, and they want the government not involved in it. They're going to be very pro-military, and he's going to kind of be the first modern conservative to be elected president. So there's our three people. We have Ronald Reagan up in the top left, Mikhail Gorbachev, and then the bottom, that guy, Muammar al-Gaddafi, he's going to be important because he's going to show the U.S. pivot away from Europe and more towards the Middle East in its foreign policy. So a little background on Reagan. Reagan is president through the 1980s. He is a conservative, like I said. He is highly anti-communist. He does not want to negotiate with the communist world. His goal is to, instead of practice containment, push back communism. He is going to physically try and roll back nations that have fallen to communism. He's going to support rebellions in communist nations like the communists had done to us in Vietnam and in South America. So he's going to try and do the opposite. He's going to try and take the offensive to fight back against communism. He even calls it the evil empire at one point to kind of frame how he views it. So the US's focus is still going to be on the Soviet Union. That's our biggest enemy. We know it is. Both countries really aren't paranoid because they do want to destroy each other's systems. We're going to confront communism in the developing world. The developing world is places mostly in Africa, Latin America, a little bit in Asia, where communism finds fertile ground because usually the economies aren't that good. There's wealth inequality, so people like the idea of that equality across the board. But we're going to see an increased attention to the Middle East. This is because of the rise of partly Islamic fundamentalism. You learned about the Iran hostage crisis and how Iran turned to a theocracy that was very fundamentally Islamic. That is going to begin to sweep a lot of the Muslim world, and it's going to lead to a lot of internal strife and terrorism. So some examples are in Libya. We bomb Muammar al-Gaddafi because he supports terrorism. He had been supporting terrorist groups that had hijacked airplanes, blown up airplanes, hit an airport. So we bomb his house, actually, to try and take him out. We don't. He will later be killed all the way in the early 20-teens. In Lebanon, 241 Marines who were sent there to help end a civil war are killed when their barracks is blown up by a suicide bomber. And then the Iran-Contra affair, where the United States sold weapons illegally to Iran to release hostages that were being held in Lebanon, and then that would force the Contras in Nicaragua to be able to fight because we could fund them with the money we got from the illegal weapons sales in Iran. But our main focus, obviously, is going to be the end of the Cold War. So Reagan pursues a military pressure on the Soviet Union. Now, we still can't invade Eastern Europe, Soviet Union, because of nuclear weapons. And obviously, by the 80s, it really is the end of the world if we have a nuclear war. But he comes up with this idea called peace through strength. And the idea is the United States is going to become so powerful militarily that no one can mess with us and it'll bring peace. So we develop new weapons like the B-1, B-2 stealth bombers you can see down there on the right-hand corner, the new nuclear missiles that are faster, fly farther, and go higher than the Soviets ones. And the Strategic Defense Initiative. In the bottom left-hand corner, you can see kind of an artist's rendition of it. It becomes known as Star Wars because the idea is it would use satellites and lasers and missile batteries on the ground to shoot down Soviet ICBMs that were launched at the United States. If we could shoot down their nuclear missiles, the Soviet Union no longer had a check on us. It's not known if this was even possible in the 80s, but kind of the whole point of this was to outspend the Soviet Union. Reagan believed quite correctly that the United States economy was stronger than the Soviet Union's. So his goal was, we're just simply going to outspend them militarily and collapse their economy. The Soviets can't afford to build all these new bombers, these new missiles, these new tanks, these new missile systems. And what happens is he thinks that because they can't spend on domestic things like roads, bridges, schools, hospitals, they spend it all on their military, it'll eventually lead to the collapse of their system. So you can see here some of the programs that Reagan pushed through. The United States defense spending skyrocketed. This is partly why the United States military is such a powerful military machine today, because all the weapons we use were kind of born out of the 1980s defense spending from the Reagan administration. So, like I also said, he's going to try and roll back some of the communist tide by funding operations in the developing world. So, we do what's called covert operations. We don't directly invade nations that have communism, but we support the people who are fighting communism. So, we're going to support anti communists anywhere they are. One of the most famous is in Afghanistan. The Soviets had invaded, and there were these guys called the Mujahideen, and they want to drive out the Soviet controlled communist government in Afghanistan. There's one issue about them. A lot of them are fundamental Islamist fighters who would like to basically build another Iran in Afghanistan. They will become the Taliban and they will become Al Qaeda. If you look in the picture in the left hand corner, that guy is actually a young Osama bin Laden who was supported by the United States. You can see him wearing a US coat, using a US radio with a US helmet on his head. But because he was fighting the Soviets, the United States supplied him. We supply the Contras, we already went over, in Nicaragua because they're counter-revolutionaries. They want to get rid of the communist government. We support El Salvador's anti-communist government, even though it uses things like death squads to keep power. And we even invade little tiny Grenada because it had a leftist government and it was abusing American citizens. And this leads the United States to support some real freedom fighting movements, but also some really bad governments like those in El Salvador. So some people really do want our help, like Afghanis. The Afghanis want to get rid of the communist government. But in El Salvador, the government's so brutal that who knows who really supports it. So we put economic pressure on the Soviet Union. This is probably going to be one of the largest things that affects the Soviet Union. A free market economy, a capitalist economy, is naturally more efficient than a command economy. It can make more products. It makes products cheaper. It decides where they go. It's just more flexible. So the Soviet economy had basically already failed. The U.S. military spending on the had stripped the Soviet economy of the funds it needed to actually run its society. They were just pouring money in their military to try and catch up to the US's increasing military lead. The Soviet standard of living, so the people's access to goods and services, was significantly lower than the United States. Soviet ambassadors were absolutely amazed when they came to the United States and they saw the suburbs. People in the Soviet Union, other than if you were a farmer, you probably did not have a house. That was a totally foreign concept to them. The Chernobyl disaster, the meltdown at one of their nuclear power plants, revealed their weakness of their economy. It's a major, major ecological disaster. Even today, the exclusion zone is thousands of square miles of territory that are radioactive for the next 20,000 years now. And it showed that the Soviets were having issues even keeping basic infrastructure like a nuclear power plant running in their country. And the war in Afghanistan had strained their economy. They poured billions of dollars, thousands of lives into Afghanistan, and were eventually defeated by what was a ragtag group of rebels living up in the mountains. So Mikhail Gorbachev decides to reform the USSR by using glasnost and perestroika. And the reforms backfire because what it does is it opens the Soviet Union and its economy, it opens their political system. So people begin to question the government because now there's not as much censorship, and industries now have to compete with private industry, which makes the government industries so inefficient that they begin to collapse. So a lot of those goods and services that were provided by the government skyrocket in price. This makes the people angry, which makes them question the government more, which leads to the Soviet system beginning to kind of fall in on itself. You can see up at the top left-hand corner the Chernobyl power plant that exploded literally when it melted down. But the best picture that shows the issues the Soviet Union was facing is that one on the top right, where basic necessities like bread are in short supply. The economy can no longer supply citizens with what it needs. So in 1991, the Soviet Union pretty much implodes. The Berlin Wall is torn down. That historic divide between East and West Berlin is destroyed, and Berlin is reunited. Nations begin to pull out of the Warsaw Pact because the Soviet Union is so broke, they can't even enforce it anymore. They can't enforce those nations to stay in the Warsaw Pact. And finally, on December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union itself dissolves. It just breaks up. So the effects of the breakup of the Soviet Union, Germany is reunited in 1990. Germany is not that old of a country. It was only reunited between East and West Germany in the 90s. The communists lose power all over Eastern Europe, and eventually Yugoslavia breaks up even though it wasn't part of the Soviet Union's sphere of influence. And the Soviet Union itself breaks up into 15 different republics. So there's a bunch of different republics that were part of the Soviet Union, places like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Belarus, Ukraine. So they all break up. Obviously, Russia is going to be the biggest one that comes out of the Soviet Union, but they all have their individual governments now. Instantly, most of their economies collapse because they try to make the transition from a command economy to a market economy, and that's very rough. And one of the most pressing issues was what to do with the nuclear weapons a lot of these countries had. This would be like if the United States broke up and we have nuclear missile bases in South Dakota and North Dakota and Texas. Well, suddenly those little countries now have their own nuclear weapons. So the UN is going to have to deal with that issue, and it's still kind of ongoing. You can see here the nations that broke away from the Warsaw Pact, and when communist nations pretty much lost control of their government, mostly around 89 to 91. Yugoslavia's breakup is going to be spectacularly violent, ethnic cleansing, genocide, but most countries other than Romania, it's fairly peaceful, the transition from power. There's not a lot of revolutions. It's mostly protests. You can see here the 15 individual republics that come out of the Soviet Union. Most of them were places that were nations before either the old Russian Empire or the Soviet Union actually conquered them. The biggest one is Kazakhstan to come out of the Soviet Union, but Russia is still going to be the dominant power in that area. So the reasons for the Soviet collapse are still highly disputed. Nobody really knows why all of a sudden within 2 years their system just imploded on itself. But some people believe that glasnost it allowed people to challenge Soviet rule in Eastern Europe. It allowed those critics and those newspapers and those radio shows to publish things that made people question if the Soviet system was the best way to do things. Perestroika opened up the economy, and instead of fixing the Soviet Union's economic issues, it just compounded them. And then Reagan's military buildup broke the Soviet economy. It made it seem like, even if the United States wasn't actually so far ahead that the Soviets couldn't keep up, it demoralized them and broke their economy. The major effect of the Soviet Union, I know usually I don't have one thing, I usually have several, but the main effect is that the United States, for about 20 years, 25 years, remained as the world's sole superpower. They were the only one that could hold that title of superpower. And it's still kind of true today. China's rising, but the United States is still pretty much the big kid on the block. And this is going to allow the United States now to go out and try and make the world as it wants it to be. So that was a little bit about the end of the Cold War and the big effect it's going to have on the United States. It pretty much takes us into the modern world. So if you have any questions, just let me know.